The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast. I'm just going to say hello to our presenters. I will introduce them, but Jeff and Kevin, can you see my screen okay?
I can.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome everyone to today's webcast on data modeling standards or data governance standards. In today's presentation, we're going to be explaining how a data modeling center of excellence is the foundation for building a successful metadata management and data governance program. We will be presenting potential solutions that may have arisen during the inconsistent application of data modeling practices, such as identifying real-world problems because of incorrect metadata standards. We'll also review how to develop a well-documented, repeatable data modeling process within a management modeling environment, and how an organization can evaluate the level of enforcement and implementation of their standards. However, I'd first like to start with a few important introductions today. Our first speaker that is going to be up is Jeff Jobs. Jeff is Sandhills Enterprise Architect and has been a long-time Enterprise Architect data governance specialist who's been addressing the issues of the convergence of data modeling and data governance during the past several years. Our second speaker, Kevin Weisenberger. Kevin is Sandhills Senior Consultant and has been a long-time Irwin specialist who's been addressing and supporting the Irwin data modeling product during the past several years. And of course, you're listening to Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandhills Consultants. And just for everyone's benefit, this session is being recorded. If you can't make it, we will be sending an email out in a couple of days so that you can review this and pass this along to your colleagues if they missed it. So before I hand it over to Jeff, I wanted to share with you some key principles that Sandhills believe in. And we've got the four following principles that we believe are pretty important or critical in this area. First of all, we believe standards, and more specifically data modeling standards, are the foundation for good data governance. We believe, right, that data modeling is an enterprise discipline and not just a project deliverable. Failure to data model will result in poor data quality, so model your data, folks. And please do not use spreadsheets as modeling tools. They're no substitute for data modeling tools. So adopting these key principles and using proper data modeling techniques and methodologies, which we will show you today, will allow an organization to model data in a standard, consistent, predictable manner and manage data as an asset. Also, we may just run over just the R here because we were packing a lot in, but stay tuned at the end to learn more about our data modeling assessment built around the DIMBOK data modeling knowledge areas, which we will highlight, Jeff will highlight at the end of this webcast. So with that, Jeff, let me pass it over to you to discuss the next section.
Thank you, Robert. This is a list of the topics that we're going to cover today, not necessarily in this order, but what it does is it essentially talks about the concept of data modeling and data governance and metadata management and how they're all sort of converging together. So we're going to take these topics and we're going to address them within a capability model structure that Robert has already alluded to called a center of excellence. Next slide. So adopting a data modeling best practice can offer a lot of competitive advantages for organizations that value data as an organizational asset. Building and sustaining an effective data modeling competency does require commitment across the organization from both the business and IT areas. But according to Gartner, centers of excellence are basically virtual centers where you specialize or concentrate on a certain area. And around the center of excellence is various practice areas. So you'll see in the diagram here in the middle, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each one of these different areas in a concentrated view. So first thing we're going to do is let's start with data governance. Next slide. So consistent data governance. Data governance is fundamental to allowing the organization to model data in a standard, consistent, and predictable manner so that you can manage data as a resource. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at how data modeling itself is actually integrated with lots of different areas of data management. So you can see here, I've got two parts here. I've got the DMBOK on one side and the DMM on the other side. Now, data modeling plays a big part in many areas of data management. The DMBOK wheel shows that data modeling and data design are a principal part of the area, specialization area, but they have data governance in the middle. And there's a direct relationship between data governance and data modeling. The data maturity model, on the other hand, actually has a whole bunch of different practice areas, but data modeling actually relates to a lot of the different practice areas, everything from business glossaries to metadata management to data quality, obviously data governance. So data modeling in and of itself is a very important part of data governance as well as data modeling. So you'll notice all the touch points for data modeling here. Next slide. So data modeling is a data management activity primarily, but it gets guidance from data governance. So since data modeling is intended to improve the understanding of data, it's important to align the data modeling activities that we do with the goals of the business. And so that relates to things like policies, standards, procedures. So when we start looking at these things, data governance policy is essentially what objectives do we need to meet. It doesn't actually tell us how we're going to do it. It says this is what the business wants to do. It's really a behavior concept. Data modeling procedures, well, that's how we're going to take a data modeling policy and actually implement it in data modeling. Data modeling standards, that's how we measure whether we're compliant with the rules around data. And of course, there's the metadata meaning so that the business people understand what is the meaning of all this metadata we're collecting. And since we're doing all of this stuff, we need to monitor it so that we can keep track of it and make sure that the data models stay consistent. So with all of this, it's important that we have seamless and open communication across all teams and all stakeholders so that we can have a successful data modeling center of excellence. So let's go to the next slide. So communication is a really, really important part about this whole thing because we need to be able to communicate the policies, the standards, the procedures to everybody within the organization clearly and consistently, as well as train business analysts and application developers to work with data and data models so we can reduce the communication barrier between subject matter experts, data architects, and data modelers. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Kevin, and he's going to talk about some of the methods that you can use to communicate various things to the organization around data modeling. So Kevin, to you.
Thank you, Jeff. You could see my screen.
Yep.
I can.
Okay. So not everyone has a centralized place to store their standards, procedures, processes, and best practices. We will look at this later, but for the moment, I just want to show all that we have created a centralized repository in the cloud. Our data modeling center of excellence, we branded EMSOS. During the presentation, During the presentation, we were going to talk about the data model lifecycle, which has various topics to discuss, roles and responsibilities, standards, standard operating procedures, forms, metric reports, glossaries, templates, and anything else we all want in a framework that is contained in the cloud. We'll come back to this in a couple of minutes because we will look at different aspects. Jeff, returning it back to you regarding modeling knowledge.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. So Kevin just presented an area where we can collect and communicate all that information that we're going to talk about around the Data Modeling Center of Excellence. So the next thing we're going to talk about is structuring a data modeling team. So as I previously mentioned, both business and the data modelers play roles in this process. So we're going to talk about that as well as talk about capturing business and technical metadata that we can use to build things like a data catalog. So let's start off talking about the team. So next slide, please. So there are different role players involved in ensuring a data model accurately reflects the business requirements. So some of those things are the business domain subject experts. They provide requirements to the data modeler and architect that validates the data model content. May also include data analysts as well as data scientists. Another member of the team is obviously the data modeler and data architect. Now they're responsible for developing conceptual and logical data models from those business requirements that support physical, dimensional database creation. And then lastly, the database developer, they build the physical implementation of those data structures for things like NoSQL databases, data warehouses. But within the data modeling team, you have to have some accountability level, and that's what this RACI concept is all about here. So within the team, somebody needs to be responsible for executing the work. Somebody needs to be accountable for actually delegating the work and approving any work that's done. And then, of course, there are people that want to be consulted to review the model and informed because they just want to know what the progress is. So one of the things about data modeling that's really important is this idea that you have somebody that's overseeing the work that's done, but you're also talking to people in the business to say, within the context of how you think you want to use this data, does it make sense? Does this model work for you? So it's important to begin to apply some kind of responsibility to the various roles that you use in data modeling. So let's go on to the next slide. And here we're going to talk about two major areas of metadata, the business glossary and the data dictionary. So often I'm asked, what's the difference between a business glossary and a data dictionary? So there's a bit of confusion here. So in order to clarify it somewhat, a business glossary is basically business oriented. It's for the business people, and it's a list of data-related terms and definitions that are organized for meaning. So the key takeaways here is that the business term describes a concept. And sometimes these concepts are what are called critical data elements, such as something like a product or a customer or an employee. They're big concepts, big nouns, but we all need to understand from a business perspective what they mean. And that's where the definition comes in, where you actually have a definition that's a statement of the exact meaning of a word. So this is business metadata. That's really all about what does this stuff we collect mean? Then there's the data dictionary, which is a collection of specifications for all those objects in your data model, or a metadata repository if you're just going to use a metadata repository. But the data dictionary is about the technical or abbreviated series of characters. That is what you name it technically. And the data specification itself is the precise requirement for storage. That is it a varchar of 25 characters long? Is it a percent? Is it a number? This is the precision that data models give you. So some of the quality guidelines that we look at when capturing this knowledge about the business and the systems that the business uses need to be adopted. So let's take a look at some of the quality guidelines here that you can use for developing these things. So these are what I call the 4 C's of metadata quality. Starting with clear, no cryptic jargon or ambiguity in the definitions. So try to keep it at a non-technical speak when you begin to define these definitions. Concise. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. It does not have to be multiple paragraphs of information. Keep it down to a single sentence if possible. Contextual, specific within the context in which it's used. So when we start talking about things like a definition of a customer, well, that definition is going to be dependent on, let's say, who bought a product, who received the product, who's responsible for paying for the product. You know, all of these different contexts will get you different definitions. So you've got to be precise when you start to define things. Consistency. The term name must match the definition. So if the term name is something like customer name, then whatever you're describing in the definition should match what you're talking about as far as customers go. So next, Kevin is going to show some examples of how you can collect some of this information using a data modeling tool. Kevin?
Thank you, Jeff. So in our data modeling center of excellence, under standards, data object definitions, the one thing that you have in a common repository is definitions, is how to create these data object definitions. Just so that everyone knows, these are guidelines for when you need to build data definitions, but it's not a business glossary. It doesn't hold them or contain them. These are your baseline and best practices for doing entity definitions. Here you'll see there's a snapshot of the creation of an entity definition. We also have the baseline and best practices for attribute definitions, as well as relationship definitions. So I'm going to transition or bring up Irwin Data Modeler. So I'm going to, this is the data modeling tool of choice, and show you how exactly how you would capture the data object definitions. So the model that I have open here is a simple standard model from our data modeler center of excellence. If I select the entity product, you'll see that this standard entity definition was implemented from our data modeling center of excellence. Likewise, for the attribute, again, this is a standard attribute definition that we've defined in our center of excellence. The entity or attributes developed in our data modeler center of excellence is clear, concise, contextual, and consistent. The definition isn't a paragraph, it's just a single sentence that describes in detail the meaning of this thing. So if I go to my relationship, and you'll see here that we don't have a definition. This is this is a common mistake for data modelers. The relationship has not been defined by the modeler. This is an oversight that must be corrected. Having relationships defined is part of our standards. So I'm going to take a predefined definition and just paste it into the relationship definition. So somebody else captured this for me, so I need to document it. It's important for us to understand the relationship between sales order and customer, and these will ultimately become how the business works, what the business rules are, and this is the reason why it's important to document the definitions. Reporting on your definitions is very important as well. So this is a predefined report, or that will give us a list of entities, attributes, and relationships definitions. So these, what we could do, let me just run this report. This is, and if I go to the export, here, basically the export to Excel, which you can take the information and import this into a business glossary tool, or the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, or any other cataloging tool. This completes the document, capture, and execute in Irwin Data Modeler the data object definitions. Jeff, back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. So Kevin talked a little bit about capturing the information in a data model and the importance of capturing some business rules with the relationships as well. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is design standards. This is, of course, a big area in data modeling. So design standards, they establish a common way of structuring and understanding your data. Standards include things like the presentation of a model, naming structure for how you want to name something, classifying words, and implementation documentation for utilizing the standard. But first, let's talk a little bit about the difference between standards and guidelines. I get asked this all the time. What's the difference between a standard and a guideline? They both seem to be the same thing, but in reality, they're not. And it's important to make sure that we understand the difference. First thing, standards are mandatory. You can't get around it. If it does not meet the standard, it's not gonna pass, right? Guidelines, on the other hand, are relevant processes or examples of things that have worked in the past, and they generally add some value or improvement to a model. So standards, you gotta pass them. They're mandatory. Guidelines are just helpful kinds of things that help you get things done. So let's take a look at some examples next. So design standards have a lot to do with metadata. And so there are internationally recognized standards such as the ISO 11779 series. -5 has to do with naming things. So when we talk about naming things, business names, technical names are really important. Oftentimes I'll run into people that just don't have any control over how things are named. They'll name things whatever they want, especially in NoSQL databases where you really aren't working with a predefined schema. You're just making it up as you go along. It's still important to make sure that we standardize how we name something. Data model notation. There's entity relationship model notations. There's IDEF1X. Some modeling tools support the Barker notation. So one standard notation is important because everybody needs to be able to read from the model. So you can't have one modeler doing ER and another modeler doing IDEF1X and yet another modeler doing Barker. You should have some standardization on how you're going to represent your model. And then, of course, the diagrams itself. There have been some super wild Technicolor model diagrams that I've seen. Sometimes they're a little difficult to decipher unless you standardize on colors and why you're using colors and what does color mean. Like you've got your standard traffic light, red, yellow, green. Do those actually mean something, or did I just decide I'd rather use green today than red? How are you going to name your model diagram? Because within one model, you can have several subject area diagrams. So it's really important to be able to have a consistent name for them as well. So let's take a look at naming things in a little bit more detail. This is just an example of the ISO standard 11179 data naming. And it starts with three basic areas: a prime word, a qualifying word, and a classifying word. Prime word is usually that word that describes the concept or the subject. So in this case, I've got a product and employee, both of which might actually be considered critical data elements. Qualifying word, so that adds a little bit more help to help differentiate it. So in this case, I've got a product quantity and an employee mailing address. Now, this is usually where people stop. They don't actually finish it off. But what you need to do is you need to put the classifying word on the end, and that describes the domain of values. So a product quantity, what is that quantity? Is it a percentage? Is it a number? What is it? So it's important to say that we've got a product quantity number. Same thing with employee. Yes, it's true, employees have mailing address, but how is that represented? Is it represented as text? Is it represented as a number? What is it represented at? So this is important in how you name things within your data model. But this is on the business side. How about the technology side? So let's take a look at abbreviating things. There are some standard ways that you can approach abbreviating, and this is one where a lot of people just have inconsistent abbreviations. Like let's take the word customer. In one data model, it's abbreviated CUS. In another one, it's CUST. And yet a third one, it's CSTMR. You need to have a standard abbreviation, because when you're trying to find things, you don't want to try to use 16 or 17 different variations to try to locate something within a database. And it actually makes your AI a little harder to work with as well. So when we start looking at standard abbreviations, this is what's called the root stemming method of abbreviating, where you take a word such as reference, you find its root stem, which you could find in the dictionary, and it is refer. So then you shorten that by removing some of the vowels. So you leave one vowel in and you take the other two letters off. You end up with ref. And then you can now use various endings, because you'll find a word and the word will have different variations depending on how you're using it. So you could use reference, referencing, referenced, references, referenceable. So then if you use a letter, then you can actually just append it on the end and you'll have a consistent abbreviation. And if everybody understands how you're doing the abbreviating, then they'll be able to look at the technical abbreviation and actually figure out what the word means without having to ask somebody. So next, Kevin's going to show in Modeling Tool how they can actually help automate some of this naming of metadata. So back to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Jeff. So in our data modeling center of excellence, under standards, we have the object naming, logical data objects. And here you have your guidelines for names and so forth. You can see that under the logical data objects, you can see all the objects or all the attributes. These things all need to be named. So if we look at, for example, entity, let's suppose that these are standardized names that are already defined for you. The names already exist. You don't have to come up with it. we did it in the Data Modeling Center of Excellence. Now, let's suppose that you came onto a DM team doing data modeling. You need to create some objects in a data model. How you name the objects may not be known. So this is an example where you could come to the Data Modeling Center of Excellence, and it will tell you exactly what standard is including some valuable examples. Now, if I go to the physical data objects, and here, this is, again, it gives you the guidelines for some specific database versions like Oracle and SQL Server, and how the names in the physical objects are derived or created based on these consistent physical names. So it promotes physical consistent names, physical names, and these are the guidelines that you can use in our Data Modeling Center of Excellence. I'm going to switch over to Irwin. And here we're going to just take a look at some of the Data Modeling Center of Excellence standards and apply them in Irwin DM. So again, this data model that we have is based upon the standards that we put into place. So if I go to the naming standards, and you'll see here on the glossary that the names have been abbreviated. We have words and names that are abbreviated. And these were created based on our Data Modeling Center of Excellence. The words and abbreviations have been previously imported from the external CSV file. Irwin DM standard naming standards is a blank template ready for you to mold, and so what you did take was from the data model and from the Center of Excellence class words and definitions, and imported them into Irwin itself. Now, if I just close this up and I go to my modeling naming standards, you have your logical, which controls, you could have your case controls here. Same with the physical and your name mapping. And here you'll see that within the macros, we've developed these macros to change the value of when you go from entity to table, attribute to column, and so forth. Now, these macros were created using our DM Center of Excellence. The naming will conform to the standards. The standard is to use underscores. So right now we have it set up as remove special characters, but we're going to replace with an underscore. So if I click OK and I go to the physical view of the data model, you'll see that the names have the spaces with the underscores here. And again, it conforms to our standards. Say, for example, we go back to the logical side of the data model, we see that we have first name and last name as attribute names. So first name and last name, we could add the word customer, which will conform to the ISO standard. This is why it is critical to name objects properly so that we know what type of first name and last name we're talking about, customer name or employee name. So if I just input the word customer here, Now, you'll see that if I go to the physical side, you'll see that customer has picked up the abbreviated word cost. So this has automatically made the abbreviated change. So the importance of automation of naming standards is why data modeling tools are good, because when it comes to metadata management, the tools will help enforce the standard. The data modeler won't have to think about whether the names are initial caps, because this has been built into the data modeling tool. This allows the modeler to complete their work. When you have a standard template, all parameters will probably be set up for you. You or the data modeler won't have to worry about them. Jeff, back to you regarding a library of reusable components.
Thank you, Kevin. So the next section we're going to talk about is reusable components. And I'm sure you've probably heard a lot of people say with data modeling, oh, it takes so long to do data modeling. It's really lengthy. It's really a tedious effort. Can we just skip data modeling? Well, if you start to employ things like data model patterns, you can actually accelerate your data modeling process. So let's take a look at that next. So data modeling patterns are basically building blocks that you can put together like little, fragments and build standard patterns for things. So there's patterns for things like data classifying pattern or data status pattern or all kinds of different patterns. There are books that have been written by Len Silverstein and David Hay on just these things. So they actually have libraries and books that you can use, but they're essentially standardized. So patterns offer the standard form, so it improves your modeling uniformity. And of course, they're very flexible. Patterns are basic, generalized things, and they give developers a place to start. So as an example, let's say a dressmaker might use a basic pattern to make a dress, but the dress can be altered. You can have the hemline longer or shorter. You can have short sleeves, long sleeves. It can be red, it can be black, but the basic pattern is the same. So it all starts with the building blocks, or what they generally call primitives. And when you connect them together, you form the pattern that you can reuse. And because you can reuse it, you're doing modeling faster. So you don't have to start from scratch every time you want to build a data model, which is, of course, increases the accuracy, because you don't have to worry about making mistakes because you've already tested and validated the pattern. So you know it works. So let's go on and take a look at an example here. Next slide. So if we look at this sort of diagram here, you could say that I have a standard data object. Let's say that that's your building block or primitive, but you've got various projects going on. So you've got a transactional project, you've got a data warehousing project, you've got a NoSQL project. If you've standardized that data object, you can reuse it in the different projects. So by reducing redundancy through validated and verified inventory of reusable metadata parts, you can have a base data object that's usually some kind of critical data element or master data object, or maybe a collection of things. And as I mentioned before, if you're ever looking for patterns, you can find them in various books. And I say that David Hay and Len Silverstein have written 2 that I know of, but they're validated. So data governance has been applied to these things. So by data governance, we mean that the business metadata or definitions are there, as well as the technical metadata, specification stuff we talked about is already there. And then you build these libraries of data modeling components in a reference library. The nice thing about these things is that you can measure the effectiveness of your data modeling through these reusable components. So let's take a look at that in the next slide. So as your library grows, the speed of agility begins to increase. So if we look at this thing here, this little reuse percentage pie chart over here, we can see that 55% of the model contains standard data objects. That is data model objects that you've already vetted and validated and are ready to be used. 22% are possible standard objects, but they just haven't gone through the data governance process yet. And the red part is non-standard. So over time, what you hope to do is to use more standard objects and less non-standard objects, and take your non-standard objects and qualify them as candidates and see if you can make them standard objects. So then you can generate reports that actually say, we're getting models done faster than we used to because we're just reusing stuff from other models that we've already validated. Now, there are people that do this, but the problem that they encounter is that they don't validate the object first. They just make a copy of it and stick it in their next model. But what happens is you could be perpetuating problems because there may be errors in that, or it might be the wrong context or something like that, and you just end up building models based on problematic components. So the important part here is that you need to go through a data governance process. That is, the metadata needs to be validated, and then you can build that library, and then you can just start snapping some models together. Now, next, Kevin's gonna talk a little bit about how modeling tools can assist with this. And this is where modeling tools begin to show their real usefulness for data modeling.
Thank you, Jeff. So again, in our Data Modeling Center of Excellence tool, under Data Model Lifecycle, Shared Data Object Creation, just want to show you that the knowledge base has a reference, agile or waterfall, whichever your preference of flow for, you should be able to share your data object creation. In agreement, data modelists must have a process for sharing data objects. So in Irwin DM, here I've connected to my MART repository because there's a reference library which houses a template model that has been approved shareable objects. The MART repository is the source where the reusable objects reside. So this is the temp library or model, and again, it has the employment entity code, date and flag. And what we did here is we standardized this by having not only this object or entity created, but we also have these standardized domains. Now, how do you get this information into the standard model that we use? So under Irwin, there's a place called model templates. So what you could do is take the target model and bind it to the template model. So I'm going to load the entire content, and now you'll see that employment now is within the target model, our standard model. So if I go to the subject area, you'll see employment. Now, if I open up the entity properties, let's say, for example, that we don't have a definition for employment as for the entity employment, and I update employment in our temp model. So I'm just going to grab a definition here. I'm going to copy paste. I'll save this. I'll update the temp model. And I'll save. So once this is saved, I could go back to the our standard model, and if we do a refresh template, and you again picking everything up, and if I want to go into employment entity properties, and now you'll see that the standardized definition has been updated in the entity employment. So that's the part that is completed as far as using the shared object creation. Jeff, back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. So you just saw an example of how you can take a component, if you will, and then use that component in one or more models. And then if that component changes, you can propagate those changes throughout all the different models, which will, of course, speed things up. And the more components you have, the easier it is to connect them together and to build data models quicker. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a stable monitored environment. So there's an old expression from a data management consultant that says, you can't manage what you don't measure. So monitoring is that method by which you can gauge how well your data modeling center of excellence is doing. So one of the key things that you want to be able to do is to have some kind of way of reviewing your data models to make sure that they're up to standard. So data model review is an excellent way of determining how much improvement is being made. So establishing a design review is important for model trustworthiness. You want the people that are going to use the models to be able to trust those models. So essentially you're developing a data model scorecard. And the things you want to take a look at are, is the model correct? Is it readable? Is it consistent? Are the definitions good? Because often you'll have definitions and you can say, yep, we have definitions, but need the business to evaluate the definitions so they can tell you whether the definitions are actually any good. So a solid workflow usually goes along with this checklist to help ensure the process is followed. So let's go on to the next slide here for an example. Now remember earlier I told you that it's really important to establish some sort of a RACI context so that everybody understands who's responsible for doing the work, who approves the work, who's consulted and who's informed. So usually you have some sort of a workflow process for this kind of stuff. So a data model itself is not a static artifact. It changes, so you've got to keep it up to date. So creating a formal process for change management of all your models is critical, including updating model documentation that goes along with it. So we're going to talk more about that later, but now Kevin's going to demonstrate some ways to use a data modeling tool to help you perform some of these standard checks before you actually submit it for review in a review process.
Thank you, Jeff. So again, in our data modeling center of excellence, under forms, logical data model submission and deliverable workflow, in this form, you have the checklist. They are built into the form. This is why the data modeler will look for when you finally submit your model into the workflow. Irwin DM has a model check. Has a model check that you can check for some basic things before you submit. This will save you from having to go back and redo some obvious things that you have missed. Think of it as doing the model check before you do the formal model check. These checks can say does the object have a definition? Yes or no. But the formal check will indicate if the object definition is good definition. Only people can do that. The Data Modeler Center of Excellence has formal process that I've looked at these definitions. Yes, they are good and validated by the business, and then they become a usable object. Jeff, back to you regarding documented processes.
Thank you, Kevin. So next, we're going to delve a little bit more into these processes. So we've already looked at sort of a workflow concept, but processes are critical within data modeling because processes are how the work gets done, and the document processes, sometimes called procedures, ensure consistency. So the question becomes, how does standardizing procedures help with data modeling? So let's take a look at the next slide here. There are some standard operating procedures for data modeling. And the standard operating procedure is really just a set of instructions to help modelers carry out basic routine operations you do all the time. Not the one-off stuff, not the special project-y type stuff, but the stuff you do all the time. So how does this help? Well, it achieves efficiency. So one of the things that I encounter often is they'll bring a new modeler onto a team. Now, maybe the data modeler was on the business side of the house and they were, let's say, a business analyst. They understand the business, they know how the business works, they understand the data, but now they're moving into data modeling. Well, how do I bring that new modeler up to speed faster than having them, let's say, shadow another data modeler for a month and hope they pick it up? If we have standard operating procedures, we can certainly speed that up. That, of course, increases quality because everybody's doing the same process. And we've already done quality control over these processes, so we know if you're following the process, you're going to create a quality model. It also reduces miscommunication. So there's no questions about how to perform your standard operations. Everybody knows because it's documented. So let's take a look at the next slide here and we'll see a list of some of the common ones that you should have documentation for. Now, we already looked at model review and approval. So I showed you that little flow of how the model approval process works and how it's important to have a RACI around that so you know who's responsible for doing what. But some of the other ones, model development. How do we start off building a new model? Now remember, I already talked about this idea of reusable components. But if somebody doesn't know that the first thing they should do is check the library for a component that we've already built for that particular concept, then they're going to start building something new from scratch. Not a good idea. Model reconciliation. How do I make sure that my model is current? Is it current with the database? Is it current with another logical model? So those, you got to have processes for those. And of course, issue resolution. What do we do if there's an issue that's well above the modeler? Let's say it's a policy problem. Then you have to have a way to escalate that and have somebody work on that. Another reason for having a RACI process. And of course, model maintenance, routine maintenance and update should have some standard processes around it. So some of these standard processes like model reconciliation are actually baked into data modeling tools. So next, Kevin's going to demonstrate how some of these processes are automated in data modeling tools. Kevin?
Thank you, Jeff. So under our Center of Excellence tool, under standard operating procedures, global shared object addition, you'll see that we have a set procedure here. The important part, there are 13 steps here. The important part to this is when new people come onto the team, they don't know or how your processes are or how they work. So within the Data Modeling Center of Excellence, we've already documented the procedures so that your new data modeler can get up to speed quicker. So if I switch over to Irwin DM, we have two data models that are open. These two data models are basically identical, with one model from the UK, and they have different standard name and their definitions. So what I want to do is I want to import those attribute properties to the other model, US-based model, not necessarily the names, but the definitions. So how do I go about this? I'll compare the two models, and I'm going to reconcile the definitions using complete compare. Let me just invoke complete compare. Okay, so we have the differences in the entity individual customer. You'll see that in the US-based names are customer first name, last name. In the UK-based model, you have customer given name and surname, and they have different definitions. So basically, what we have is we have attributes, but I need the definitions, but the names and definitions don't match exactly. But this is the model reconciliation process between two models that I'm using complete compare to accomplish the data definition change. So I'm going to import to the left. I'll make those changes in the definition. Which now reconciles within the US-based data model. And with that, I'm going to switch it back to Jeff to discuss the data modeling assessment.
Thanks, Kevin. So we, up to this point, have taken a look at these different areas of a data modeling center of excellence. And by data modeling center of excellence, what we're really just talking about is adding just a bit of formality to how you approach data modeling, instead of just saying, well, we have to make a data model because we are building a new database, but not having any consistent way in which you approach it, because the byproduct of all the models you create is really metadata. And what you're stuffing into these data catalogs is, in fact, metadata. Things that AI systems are using is metadata. So if you have some formality around how you approach data modeling, it goes a long way to doing metadata management. So what we're going to do here is take a look at evaluating your journey towards a consistent, trustworthy data modeling practice. So the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, well, where are we now? How can we know if we're treating data modeling as just a project deliverable or a more formalized approach to metadata creation and management? So some type of assessment will help me figure out where the gaps are, evaluate the current environment, identify where the gaps might be, determine a future state strategy. You know, what do we have to take a look at? Our standards, our procedures, our monitoring processes. So let's take a look at the next slide here and talk about data modeling assessments. So Sandhill Consultants has built a data modeling assessment. It's designed to evaluate the core competencies of the data management body of knowledge, otherwise known as the DMBOK. So in the DMBOK, there's a data modeling knowledge area specific. It's the only one that actually has, it calls out data modeling specifically. So by looking at this, there's 4 general areas within the data modeling assessment part. The planning part, which is the evaluating of a model, standardization of models, organizing of models. There's a development area, which is how well are we handling the requirements? How do we handle the creation of new models? The schema design are all part of that. And of course, the control part is if a model is going to change, how do we control the change? How do we validate that it's a good model? What are the standard operating procedures that we might have? And then the operation, the life cycle of going through a, let's say, a conceptual, logical, physical, a dev, test, production life cycle, and maintenance of models in their sort of ongoing procedures. So if we go to the next slide here, what we've done is we've built a series of questions that will help us understand where you are in the different knowledge areas, and then can present a score, if you will, on where these are. Now, one of the things that we can do here is that we can actually help you understand where your gaps are and things you might want to do to fill those gaps. We even have sample processes and procedures that you might want to use to elevate that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to hand it back to Robert for closing.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Kevin. I know we're slightly over. I mentioned at the top of the hour we may run over a minute or two. But hopefully, if we've done our job correctly, our audience will now have an understanding of the value of a data modeling center of excellence. And as Jeff has just mentioned, Sandhill does offer a quick start assessment built around the DMBOK knowledge management areas, plus our own experience in data modeling over the 20 plus years, which we use to perform this assessment. Our goal is to provide a proven and effective approach to developing a shared, accepted, and useful data modeling center of excellence. We also, and I noticed some questions in there, I'll just get to the last couple of questions shortly, but we noticed that you may have seen Kevin presenting a framework, a jumpstart, a data modeling center of excellence, which we call enterprise modeling set of standards. Now, the interface may be a little bit less up to date than some people would like, but the content is key and valuable, and that's what we're providing in this framework. So EMSOS, as we affectionately call it, provides all the necessary standards, processes, and checklists that can greatly reduce the time spent on creating and or developing your own data modeling center of excellence. So if you're interested in the assessment or the framework, the EMSOS, you can contact us. Now, with that, I'd like to thank people for the interaction today, and I will go through, Jeff and Kevin, if you can stand on the line. There were a couple of questions. Just let me see if I can go back to those questions. So, and I thank the audience for using the question box to put in your questions. So there was a question that was asked, if I can see it, on the do you know, I can't see the questions. Hold on a minute. I think I'd only shown the answered questions. So sorry, Jeff, Kevin. Let me. Here we go.
Okay. I did see the one where I have to correct the spelling on my slide.
Yeah,
I will
no.
do a mea culpa on that one.
Yes, that's okay.
I'll check. Eluded me on that one.
Yeah, I've got the question. So one of the questions from Joel. So how can you justify an abbreviation since the current system effectively does not have an object name length limitation as before. So,
well, your abbreviations are generally based on what the total length is. So for instance, if you're using Oracle as your database, I think you're still limited to 30-character name. If you're using SQL Server, I think you get 128 names, characters. So when you're deriving your abbreviation standard, you have to take into account that you may actually have to abbreviate some of the abbreviations to make them fit, but that's really a technological limitation on certain things. What you probably don't want to do, and I've seen this done before, is they'll spell out the word customer or something like that unless they have something like customer account verification number, and it becomes too long. Then they have two instances of customer in the database where one it's spelled out and the other one it's abbreviated, which gets to be confusing because it's like, are they talking about customer or custom or some other variation? But you do have to take into account consideration the where it's going to be stored, what the actual vendor storage is.
Right.
well, Kevin, did you want to add to that?
No, yeah, other than Jeff is correct. It's database specific, whatever. It's whatever supported by that DBMS.
Excellent. And Jeff and Kevin, there was another question that came in on the reusability. So how does the modeler know that in this example, M0101 is the same as master policy number? How would they know that?
Can you say that again? So you have an object and it's called M.
One of the audience members said, he started first of all saying, is there a bridge from the ugly in use as in non-standard names to the go forward standards?
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
So the way that I usually approach that is what is in place already. I probably don't try to go back and retrofit it. What I usually do is say that all projects going forward should conform to the new standard, but we will in some way have lineage or traceability back to, and data modeling tools have this, back to the old instance where you use the more cryptic abbreviation. So the idea is that over time, newer projects using the newer standard will ultimately, you get to a point where you're now using that standard and the other stuff still exists, but you're no longer using the old stuff.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And we are pretty much answered the questions that we had there. We are over time, but just basically for our audience, I'd like to thank you for watching the session. We will be sending out an email with follow-ups and a link to the recording and the PDF version of PowerPoint slides. And please feel free to reach out to any of us at the email address on the screen. If you're interested in our data modeling quick start assessment or our enterprise modeling set of standards framework to manage your data modeling center of excellence. On behalf of everyone, thank you very much indeed. Kevin, Jeff, thank you very much indeed for your time as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.